You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars.
Today I am driving the member of the 911 GT3 family that should be my favourite of them all. Yet when I last drove it, I really couldn't gel with the 997.1. Let's discuss. To break this car down into its component parts, there is nearly nothing about it that I don't like. Take your pick of the screaming 3.6 litre 8,400 RPM Metzger flat 6, making here 415 horsepower and around 300 pound-feet of torque. That's about 405 newton meters. Or the beautiful and elegant styling. This car is based on the Carrera 4 997.1. It takes that car's body shell because it's a little stiffer, but unlike the RS, it doesn't use the wider 4S body shell, so it's still rather svelte. And with this rear wing that harks back to the original 996.1, I think it's a beautiful thing. Presented here in entirely unadorned white, it looks every inch the race car ready to get its stickers. The interior of the 997 is a big step up over the 996. That is true for all models, and the GT3 is no exception. Whilst it's hardly luxurious, it is focused, to the point, and exactly the kind of thing you want in a car like this. You also have beautiful, very typical 911 steering. Light, delicate, but very feelsome, weights up when you want it to, and is a joy. To your left, you'll also find the one and only gearbox option for these cars, a 6-speed manual. But it's that which gave me the biggest problem. You see, this car's engine really does require revs to get the best from it, and I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. The GT3s have always been the same. Because the car is geared fairly long and the gearbox is not one that can really be rushed, particularly for, say, second to third changes, you can often find yourself never quite in the right gear or at the right RPM. The last time I drove one of these cars, it was in an environment where you think it should shine the most, on track. However, I was at Blyton Park, and although I really love Blyton, it's a circuit that seems almost custom made to make sure that the 997 GT3 is never quite happy. I'm no track driver really, but I found myself frustrated with the car because at no point ever did I feel like I ever had the right gear. Either you found yourself bumping into the limiter in the middle of a bend, which you don't really want, or if you changed up a little early, you found yourself not getting the car's power and therefore not going as quickly as you felt you should. The net result was that on a very casual and enjoyable day, I found myself completely unable to keep up with somebody in a 981 Spider, and that just shouldn't be the case. However, today we are very far away from Blyton Park. We are on instead my home roads. These are tight, narrow, twisty little things that can put a big smile on your face, and I'm hoping here is where the 997 GT3 and I are finally going to see eye to eye, because it's here where outright speed and performance isn't really that much of a concern. Not that the 997.1 was shy though. This was the first GT3 car to actually make more than 400 horsepower, though everyone guessed that the old 996.2 GT3 RS made around the 400 mark. They never claimed any more than the same 381 as in the regular GT3. This engine is a member of the fabled Metzger family, here still displacing its original 3.6 litres. For the .2 generation, that moved up to 3.8, and that was also the car that saw the 4 litre for the first time. For the 991 generation of GT3, Porsche made a number of changes that for some locked in the reputation of the 997 as the best of them all. Those included a move exclusively to the wider body shell, making the GT3 a little less wieldy on tight country lanes, the replacement of the famous Metzger engine with a bespoke version of the then new DFI engine as seen in other 911s, and perhaps most controversial of all, out went the manual gearbox and in came the sole option of PDK. For the second generation of 991 GT3, the manual did make a reappearance, now as a no-cost option. But for many, it is this Metzger engine which really was always the star of the show. I am actually a really big fan of the later DFI engines. I think they have a character all of their own. But you have to admit that the Metzger is a very special thing. Not the most potent, not the most able, but full of character. The earlier 996s in particular, when they were idle, they would just chunder and make all sorts of noises, and if you didn't know them, you'd think they were broken. But they're not. Another improvement made for the 997 GT3 was the introduction of adaptive dampers. The car got PASM for the first time with 2 settings, regular and sport. The idea is that in normal mode, it's about the same as the old 996's passive setup, but if you press the sport option, it will firm things up even further in a setting that really is designed for the track. I have tried the car this morning in both modes, and honestly, for me, normal is what you want for the suspension. Sport just seems to want to bounce you around. This car's owner actually quite likes sport mode. I'm not such a fan. Anyway, now we find ourselves on a decent bit of road. Let's see what the car's got. Certainly makes a decent noise. You have probably guessed by now that the exhaust isn't entirely standard. As it happens, Chris, the very kind owner of this car, doesn't like it all that much. It was the result of necessity rather than desire. You see, what happened was the car already had the back box taken off to give it just a little bit more volume. Then, one of the catalytic converters cracked, so he needed to replace them. Porsche genuine items, unsurprisingly, quite expensive, so he fitted some Fab-Speed sports cats. However, the combination of the sporty cats and the general lack of back box means that this car is quite vocal. As I had hoped, on the road, that need to keep the engine on the boil to get the best from it is just that bit less of a problem. It's still got some pull from relatively low down, but if you want the best from it, you do have to work the gearbox. I am actually also starting to get to grips with said gearbox. It is very nice to use, but just when you're crossing the plane, you can not rush it. I'm sure with more experience, perhaps I'd be able to, and it's not like it's really holding me back here. What this does mean, though, is that with this car you can indulge in something I call driving a fast car slow. A lot of people talk about the joy of driving a slow car fast, rightly so, because it's brilliant. However, I also do often enjoy driving these cars which have lots and lots of performance, but not really using all of it, going out and pretending your red line is, say, $4,000, and I know a lot of people will think, well, what's the point in that? That's boring, that's silly. If you don't need the rest of the RPMs, you don't need a car with them. Well, no. If you want to make an overtake or something like that, you do want to use all the RPMs. It's the safest way of doing so, but I don't always feel like I need all the performance that the car has all of the time. It's just unnecessary. Some cars are actually very good at doing this, some are not. This is quite fun. Allow me to demonstrate. that little section there, I could have done the entire thing in 1 year, probably gone quicker. But instead, I changed gear loads of times, and as a result, had a lot more fun. And then, when you do get a nice, straight, clear stretch of road, and you really want to give it the beans, you can. The damping in this car is actually pretty decent. It is very firm. It is very close to what you call acceptable in a road car. The right about now actually is the exhaust, which is slightly more frustrating. This car comes with the optional carbon bucket seats, £3,000 when new. Although remember, the list price of one of these was actually under 80. You could also, for about £6,000, have had carbon ceramic brakes, but this car does not. And actually, I think it's perfectly fine without them. The pedal feel is absolutely excellent. You need, in typical Porsche fashion, just a little bit more movement than you might think to bring the car to a stop, but it's got more than enough ability. The throttle is also nice and linear. I prefer it without sport mode on, and one of the best things about all old 911s is true here. It doesn't feel like a particularly big car. Though you don't have exactly the same view out as saying, oh, they're cool Porsche, it feels infinitely smaller than the new 992, which is actually quite a big and rather daunting car to drive on a road like this. The steering is certainly a highlight, although I have to say, I don't think it's the best 911 steering I've ever experienced, and in truth, the 997 Turbo that I drove recently, I think steered just as well, if not maybe, and this is going to be controversial, a touch better. I fully accept that that doesn't sound or seem right, so there's every chance that with a little bit of geo and some slightly fresher tyres on this car, that will fix everything. I'm also happy to report that in the year that Chris has had it, it's also been very reliable. Nothing really has gone wrong with it, with the exception of a lambda sensor, which if you've spotted an engine warning light, that's what that's all about. As it happens, these seats I actually do really quite like. They are snug. Porsche bucket seats always do seem to be a little narrower than some others, but I've got no issues here. I fit in them quite well, and they do, as you might hope, hug you very nicely. The interior maybe has a little bit more Alcantara in it than I would like. This is a simply personal preference, but you cannot deny that it does suit the image of this car fairly well. Around town, it's actually fairly mild-mannered. You've got a reasonable amount of space in the boot up front, although because this is based on a Carrera 4, you haven't got quite as much as you would in some other cars. There were two reasons, apparently, that Porsche's GT department chose to use a C4 as the base for these. First off, the body shells are a little bit stiffer, have some more welding in them. But secondly, and this is the thing I don't hear about so much, is the fact that because these cars were designed to have front-wheel drive system in them, the GT department took that out and could use the extra space to mount the fuel tank just a little bit lower. The last old-school 911 that I drove was the 996 C4S, the speed yellow former Porsche GB press car. One of the big differences between that and this is that you feel like you have a lot more room in this. The steering wheel in those is quite large, it only adjusts forwards and backwards, and you always seem to sit a little higher than you feel is natural, meaning that in many cases there's next to no room for your thighs. Very frustrating. In here, I feel nothing of that. I've got loads and loads of room. This is more than adequate. Ooh, something really weird just happened there. I put my foot down about 2,500 RPM and the car just, 2,500 RPM. There's a massive dead spot. I actually remember my dad had a 997.1, just C2S, and that had exactly the same thing. In fact, is it only in third gear? Yeah. Third gear, 2,500 RPM, there is a real weird dead spot. I've had this in a few cars. I believe it's actually something to do with noise regs, so it's for the noise you make when exiting a village. And essentially what the manufacturers did was program in a little delay. So when you put your foot down, it doesn't really do anything. Then by the time the car's making noise, you are far enough away from the noise meter for it to not be a problem. That's quite frustrating, because actually 30 mile an hour is the speed you find yourself at a lot. My Evora 400 had the same thing. Right about now, the biggest problem I think that this car has is the fact that people do really, really want them. So the basic principles of supply and demand have meant that they are quite expensive. In fairness, the 997 GT3, maybe the second gen more than this, never got super cheap like the 9960 did. They dropped a lot, and I suppose they got to maybe £50,000 or so, but I don't ever remember them being up for 30 odd grand like the 996s were. But now, the cheapest example of a 997.1 GT3 on Auto Trader is up for 99 grand. Yeah, that's a lot. Is it worth it? Hold, please. In my last GT3 review of the new 992, many people criticised me for driving that car on the road, and apparently all the reasons I had for not liking it, despite saying it was a brilliant car, because it's a brilliant car, were because I wasn't driving it on track. However, as it turns out, the opposite is true here, because when I last drove it on track, it didn't really make an awful lot of sense. Here, on the B roads of Britain, it makes a lot more. I like it. You can push on with it in the bends, however, the front will begin to wash wide first and give you a sign you probably need to back off. I think if I had a little bit more heat in these tyres, it might be a little bit grippier, but many a classic 911 feels just like this. That does mean on this kind of road, you do have to treat the car with real respect. This was actually the first GT3 to get traction control. None of the 996s actually had it. But Porsche will be the first people to tell you that you shouldn't really rely on that. It cannot alter the laws of physics, so if you pile into a corner far too hard, there's really not much the car can do to save you from yourself. For your less experienced driver, or someone that wants to use the car all year round, doesn't want to put up with some of the GT3's quirks, I would say still better off buying a 997 Turbo. It is a car that has an equal amount of character, just deployed in a very, very different way. As a daily drivable car, that is infinitely better, much more comfortable, has a lot more luxury features, and although it started as the more expensive car, is now actually quite a bit cheaper. On the other side of things, if you are the sort of person that does want to go and take your car on a track day, you do enjoy taking it to the max at every opportunity, a 991.1 GT3 isn't really that much different in price now to one of these. And for that you get an even more zingy, even more high RPM engine, a PDK gearbox that's actually quite mechanical in nature and rather enjoyable, and a chassis that is extremely capable. I also rather like the way that it looks, and of course, if this sort of stuff matters to you, all of the infotainment interior stuff will also be a little bit more up to date as well. Though I'm not sure whether it's ever meant to be a rival directly for this car or an RS, the 430 Scuderia now is also a lot more money. They always were, in fairness, but you'd be looking at paying double what it cost to get into one of these to get into one of those, and they deliver a very different driving experience. For me, there is some of that price that can be justified, and then of course there are other bits that cannot. What more then do you really want to know about this car? Is it a proper 911? Yeah. Is it a proper GT3? Was I wrong? Sort of. In the scenario I drove it, I can see why I did not get on with this car. But here on the road, where people would tell you it should be worse, I rather like it. Just needs to be a little bit quieter, this one. But we already know that. That then is a big thank you from me for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button. Please comment down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.